for this special event marking the new semi-permanent exhibition in the Scheepvaartmuseum on the transatlantic trade, and also the events together with the John Adams and so many friends and sponsors and patrons and members and family members of you with Harvard historian Tiya Miles. A special word of welcome to you, Tiya. Thank you for joining us. You were supposed to be here a few months ago, but a snowstorm got in the way, so we made sure we had better weather for you today. I will keep it very, very brief. My role this evening is to introduce the American ambassador to the Kingdom of the Netherlands, Shefali Razdan Dougal. Shefali.
I think a lot of you heard me earlier talk about how huge the step was back here. So sorry about that. So, good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you to a very special evening. My name is Shefali Razdan Dougal, the United States Ambassador to the Kingdom of the Netherlands. I would like to first thank the organizations responsible for tonight's event. Thank you, National Maritime Museum, for hosting us in this beautiful space. The National Maritime Museum also hosted the Transatlantic Slavery Conference earlier today. It has been wonderful to witness so many distinguished researchers and bright minds gathered here, working to interpret and confront the history and legacy of transatlantic slavery. I would also like to express profuse gratitude to the Fulbright Commission, the Netherlands, for partnering in the production of this evening's gathering. Thank you for bringing together alumni of the Fulbright program, sometimes well after they participated in an academic exchange program in the United States, at the annual John Adams Fulbright Commission lecture. The partnership between the Binational Fulbright Commission and the John Adams Institute, two very close and longtime partners of the U.S. Mission in the Netherlands, is deeply motivational. Together, this partnership builds and sustains the strong people-to-people ties and mutual understanding between our countries, and further invests in the future of the Dutch-American relationship. Thank you, Nye and Van Ditmar, for publishing the book, All That She Carried in Dutch, and for your support in bringing Dr. Miles to be with us here tonight. And of course, thank you to the John Adams Institute, our trusted and historic partner. You continue to find the best and brightest of our fellow Americans to invite to the Netherlands, to share their thoughts and ideas with an always engaged audience. Here tonight is Dr. Tiya Miles, a fantastically gifted storyteller. She is a perfect example. Thank you, Tiya, for using your God-given talent for storytelling to tell the stories the world needs to hear. And like Dr. Miles, to her surprise, I also grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio. We grew up just about a mile apart from each other. I spend a lot of time thinking about racism and sexism and about the history of colonialism. I have always been extremely cognizant of that history, as it is often taught, and it is incomplete. Realities have been left out. stories about people who lacked power, people who were oppressed or enslaved, people who were female, people who lived on the margins of society. When we teach history without these very real perspectives, we perpetuate the lie that their existence made no significant contribution to the present, that their lives did not matter. Dr. Miles' books are empowering and give a voice to people whose stories are too often left out in the historical record. Their lives did matter. Women, immigrants, indentured servants, refugees, indigenous people, Africans who survived the brutality of slavery, and many others, built from the ground up the United States into the country it is today. Our collective history is the history of the United States. We matter, and we belong. Someone who has also impressed upon me the power of storytelling is my dear friend, Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, Lonnie G. Bunch III, who visited the Netherlands this past October. Secretary Bunch also spoke at a public event organized by the John Adams Institute. The main reason for Secretary Bunch's visit to Amsterdam was the Dutch National Slavery Museum, which is scheduled to open on Java Island at the close of this decade. The City of Amsterdam and the Ministry of Education, Culture, and Science hosted a conference to announce the plans for the museum. As the former founding director of the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, Secretary Bunch was able to share lessons learned from the lengthy process of building and opening that iconic and extremely necessary museum. He shared that people from all backgrounds visit the African American Museum on the National Mall to learn what it means to be an American. It is not a museum by or for one group, but rather a museum explaining the nuances and entirety of the United States history, warts and all. I was elated to learn Secretary Bunch will be making a virtual experience in this evening's program. I had the pleasure of having breakfast with Secretary Bunch when I was back in Washington 2 weeks ago. He told me that he remains in constant contact with the people who are working on the Netherlands Museum about the history of slavery. The United States and the Netherlands are working together to acknowledge the painful parts of 400 years of shared history and to address the ways that history continues to shape the lives of people on both sides of the Atlantic. And though it took several hundred years for slavery to be legally abolished, and even longer before true equality became a reality for Black Americans, there were those, even centuries ago, who recognized the injustice and plight of the moral fabric of the United States when it came to the topic of slavery. John Rankin, abolitionist and local newspaper man, said in 1823, "Involuntary slavery is a never-failing fountain of the grossest immorality and one of the deepest sources of human misery. It hangs like the mantle of night over our republic and shrouds its rising glories. I sincerely pity the man who tinges his hand in the unhallowed thing that is fraught with the tears, with the sweat, with the groans and the blood of hapless millions of innocent, unoffending people. One contemporary person whose scholarship has put the experiences of people of color on the map, quite literally, is Jennifer Tosh. Last year, I had the pleasure of bringing a group of embassy and consulate employees along with me for her Black Heritage Tour, which took us through Amsterdam by boat, and I recommend it to everyone. Jennifer founded Black Heritage Tours 10 years ago and has since taught so many people, Dutch, Americans, and others, about the role that slavery played in the history of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. She also shares stories of the people of color who have been living in the Netherlands for centuries, most certainly including the often overlooked contributions of people of color to Dutch social, political, cultural, and economic life. Jennifer, thank you so very much for shining your radiant light upon the dark corners and leading the way forward. We owe so much to trailblazers like you. Jennifer, please do share a few words. Thank you.
Mia, I love you so much. Wow, what an introduction. We can just go home now. So I'm sorry, this is not about me. Thank you so much, Ambassador Dugal. Welcome, everyone. Good evening. Oh, you've got to do better than that. Come on. Talk to me. All of you that know me know that I like to have a conversation. Good evening. Good evening. Well, that's better. We have had an amazing day, a full day. I am honored to have been invited. Thank you to the John Adams Institute and to the Scheepvaart Museum for this amazing day that you have organized and the evening that follows. For all of you to be here, welcome. I am, as Ambassador Dugal has already announced, Jennifer Tosh. I am your moderator for this evening. I am looking forward to an engaging and lively conversation with Dr. Miles. And my job right now is to introduce her, and I will do that. And following my introduction will be the video introduction by Dr. Lonnie Bunch. I have to first say this in getting to know Tiya, as I may now familiarly call her, because we're now good friends. You probably have the longest CV I've ever read. And I'm so proud. And trying to distill 25 pages, literally down to like 2 paragraphs, was impossible. But I hope that I have done it justice, and thank you for being here. Dr. Miles is a professor of history at Harvard University, Radcliffe Alumni Professor at Harvard Radcliffe Institute, Director of Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History at Harvard University. She received her master's in women's studies from Emory University in 1995 and her PhD in American Studies from the University of Minnesota. Dr. Miles also taught in the Department of Ethnic Studies at the University of California in Berkeley, which you didn't know, Tiya, was my alma mater. So we have that too. She taught at the faculty of the University of Michigan for 16 years as a professor of American culture, history, Afro-American and African studies, Native American studies, and women's studies. Her research and creative interests include African American, Native American, American women's histories, literatures, lives, as well as public history, public humanities, and environmental humanities. Dr. Miles has written several books, extensively published, and has an illustrious career with many awards and accolades to her credits. I will do no justice in even trying to read a partial list. But for this evening, we are focused on her book, All That She Carried, The Journey of Ashley's Sack. A Black Family's Keepsake. New York, Random House, first published in 2021. And for this audience, for a Dutch context, it's now been published in Dutch, which I think is wonderful. She has also won many awards, including National Book Award for Nonfiction, a Best Book of the Year in the New York Times, Washington Post, The Atlantic, The Time magazine. You understand what I mean. I could go on and on. I am really honored and proud to make my acquaintance with you, Dr. Miles, now Tiya. And I'm really looking forward to your talk, but before she approaches the podium, an introduction by Lonnie Bunch. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope that all is well in Amsterdam. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you today. When I think of the story of Ashley Sack, an item and its provenance so beautifully illustrated in Dr. Miles' book, All That She Carried, I think of the power of Black women, of family, and of breathtaking resilience. A cotton sack is so unassuming, so simple on its face, but any object can be imbued with a far deeper meaning and greater value given the right circumstances. This atom, this sack, was a means of survival, of preserving memory and culture. Despite a daughter ripped away from her mother by incomprehensible the evils of slavery, it was, and still is, as the embroidered sentiment on it exclaims, a vessel that contains love. It reminds me of the way the women in my family, too, are indelibly linked, their own thread connecting our lineage across time and space. I was able to learn about my great-great-grandmother, Candace Bunch, when I searched the Freedmen's Bureau records, a massive list of the formerly enslaved created by the government after the Civil War. My research led me to a simple page documenting the plantation where Candace toiled after gaining her freedom. It was a revelation, one which shed so much light on my ancestor and on myself. In 1867, she made all of $11 for 44 days of work. That doesn't account for what she paid the plantation owner for soap and for cotton. And yet, despite Candace's meager earnings, the document showed that she had spent 60 cents on 2 baker tins, more than an entire day's pay. It was a real insight of what she valued. Perhaps the act of baking for her family became a tradition passed down through generations. Discovering those tins reminded me of my paternal grandmother, Leanna Bunch, who used to bake cookies with similar tins when I was a little boy to convince me it was time to go to sleep, to take a nap. That connection brought tears to my eyes. Ashley Sack reminds us of the importance of telling these stories, of writing the historical record, and honestly telling the full story of all peoples of a nation. Objects like these are so important because they help us reckon with our racial past. We are fortunate to have this poignant artifact on display at the National Museum of African American History and Culture when it first opened to the public in 2016. It was loaned by us by the Middleton Place Museum in South Carolina. It is so fitting that you're gathered in the Netherlands to discuss this artifact and equally important, the legacy of slavery. King Willem-Alexander's and Prime Minister Rutte heartfelt apologies for the nation's role in the transatlantic slave trade were an admirable step, I would argue, towards healing. As I recall from my time in the Netherlands, your determination to build the National Slavery Museum, by that action, you're making a powerful statement for the world to hear, a cry to understand, a cry to remember. Your commitment embraces my belief that only by facing the unvarnished truth can we move towards a better future as a people, as nations, and human race. I am so gratified that the National Museum of African American History and Culture played a part in telling the story of Ashley Sack. And I'm even more pleased that it inspired Dr. Miles to pen such a creative and meticulously researched book that breathes life into the stories of Ruth, Ashley, and their family's journey. Again, I wish I could be with you. Congratulations on a special day and talking about a special object.
Good evening, you all.
Good evening.
The room looks quite different from up here. Well, I am absolutely thrilled to finally be here. You heard the story of what happened when I was intended to come in February. We had this big storm called a nor'easter that hit the northeastern coast of the U.S., and cities shut down, schools shut down, airports shut down. And so we had to postpone and hope that we could make this happen at another time. And I don't think there could have been a better time than today. I am so pleased that this program is now connected with the Atlantic Slavery Symposium that was held in the museum today. Thrilled to be here with fellow scholars, hoping to connect with you all on the ideas that you shared. And I have to say that it feels as if 3 miracles have happened during my very brief time in Amsterdam. I arrived yesterday evening. You're not going to believe this. I know you're not going to. This is why I use the term miracles. I got into the Anne Frank house last night. I got into the Van Gogh Museum late this morning. And I am told this is the most beautiful day that Amsterdam has seen in weeks. So I feel quite fortunate. Of course, I would not be here if it weren't for the John Adams Institute, and especially for Ian Kenny, who I don't see where, there you are, Ian, who has been emailing with me and Zooming with me and texting with me for months to make sure this went smoothly, and who has been just so kind and warm-hearted throughout all of this. The title that I've given to my presentation for today actually comes from the conversation that Ian and I had. I also want to thank my Dutch publisher and Nina Wolf, who was working with Ian to bring me here, for bringing all that she carried into the Netherlands and into the Dutch language and into the Dutch diaspora. I'm so grateful that the story of these incredible women can now be read by many other people. And I want to thank you for listening to me in English if it's not your first language, because I have no Dutch at all, and I appreciate your forbearance. The next thing I will say by way of preamble is that I have a very strong fondness for old buildings. When I was little, growing up in Cincinnati, Ohio, and oh my goodness, the connection with the ambassador blew my mind. But when I was little growing up in Cincinnati, Ohio, I actually loved walking the streets of the old city and going into abandoned buildings and houses and just imagining what might have taken place in those spaces. I tend to say to basically protect my dear mother that my parents did not know that I was doing this. And I also tend to say that I think these are the experiences that led me to pursue a profession that is deeply committed to historical interpretation and understanding. It was being in those real material spaces where people lived their past lives and feeling my imagination just open up in those spaces. I think the places that we spend time in become such an important part of our lives, of our sense of self, our sense of community, and our personal narratives, and they matter tremendously. So you won't be surprised to know that as I was walking into this building, my first question was, when was this built? This is an old place. And old places have a lot of weight about them, don't they? They carry the history of the ages. They carry the emotions of the people who have moved through them and spent time in them. And this building feels heavy to me. But it's also filled with light in a way that I could not have expected when I entered those huge doors. There's something about this space that mirrors or echoes the history that I want to share with you this evening. As Jennifer and I will be discussing, my friend now, we're on casual terms, this evening. And that mirror or that echo has to do with the seriousness and the heaviness and the weightiness and even the pain of the truth of history combined with the light, combined with a sense of hope and possibility for change in the future. So my object here is to just spend a few minutes offering remarks that will give you an overview of my book, All That She Carried. And I'd like to tie together histories of slavery and present-day legacies, experiences, and creative projects, which takes my work on Ashley Sack as an example. And of course, we have already heard about Ashley Sack from the incredible Dr. Lonnie Bunch. I'm so delighted he was able to do that video. And so you have a sense of what it is that we'll be discussing. This is an antique object that dates back to the period of formal enslavement in the US. So I'm going to talk a bit about the potential of material culture to serve as an archive or a source of historical research and knowledge. And then I also want to share some images and stories that I have gathered from readers about other kinds of things handed down in families. Sometimes these things are very old. Sometimes they are quite new, but they have been crafted with a sense of tradition. And in every case, these things, old and new, carry the beauty and the weight of history, creating a kind of social fabric. So I want to suggest, by way of my remarks, that artifacts and treasured objects can spark intellectual engagement and also reinforce genuine connection between and among people, even when the subject matter is as difficult as forced human bondage. So you are now viewing the back of an unusual object known as Ashley's sack. And Ashley's sack is the focal point of my book, All That She Carried, which is in some ways an object history. This is a seed or flour sack manufactured in the mid-1800s. And in the book title, All That She Carried, I intend for that pronoun she to signify the women and girls who carried and passed down the sack, as well as the sack itself. Dr. Bunch mentioned that my going to the Smithsonian and seeing the object in person inspired my research and the book, and it did. And it was during that experience when I saw this sack that you're now viewing the back of in a museum exhibition that was interpreting enslavement, that I felt that the sack still had some kind of life of its own, some kind of animacy. And I thought, this sack is not just an it. This sack is also some kind of a living thing that carries the energy, the hopes, the imaginations of the people who used it in the past. Now, before I began my extensive research on Ashley's sack, there wasn't a great deal of information about the object. The information that did exist had been pulled together by curators at Middleton Place Plantation. And Dr. Bunch mentioned that it is Middleton Place Plantation, which is also a foundation, that actually owns the object. So I want to read to you the first information that was collected about the sack by curators at Middleton Place. This information was very helpful to me in doing my research, and it is to the credit of the curators that they were able to find these details. But I also want you to listen for what is not a part of this description, the very first one from a museum catalog created by Middleton Place Plantation. And this is a quote from their archives describing the sack. Charleston, South Carolina, circa 1850 sack, 1921 needlework. Plain weave cotton ground, cotton lock stitch fabrication, 3-strand cotton embroidery floss, backstitch embroidery. Height 29, 11, and 16 inches by width 15 and 3/4 inches. Sacks made of plain weave cotton, like this example, were manufactured for flour, seeds, and other food staples beginning in the late 1840s with the invention of the industrial sewing machine. Unlike stitching by hand, the double locking chain stitch produced by the machine made a seam strong enough to hold heavy contents. The numerous worn spots had been reinforced with rectangles of cloth carefully hand sewn in place. So you hear there many specifics about the sack, but you also hear absences. Yes. It was these absences that I attempted to address in my work. And they had to do with the people themselves, the women themselves, the enslaved laborers themselves who used this sack. They were nowhere to be found in the earliest descriptions, and that is by no fault of the curators. It is because information about them was hidden in the archives and, to the greater extent, not even recorded at all. It is an accident of history. And another miracle that we can add to that list of miracles that I began with today, that this artifact has even survived. In 2007, a flea market shopper found it in a bin of rags. After numerous twists and turns, she donated the item to Middleton Place Plantation, which lent it to the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture. And here on the slides you see images of these historic sites, these locations where the sack has been kept and displayed. Until March of 2021, the sack was in Washington, D.C., and then it was back in Middleton Place Plantation, which is a National Historic Landmark and a former rice estate of one of Charleston's so-called first families. And what that means is that the Middletons were one of the earliest families to own large swaths of land and many hundreds of people upon which they built their wealth, which is still visible today. Currently, the sack is on loan to a brand new museum in South Carolina, which is the Charleston International African American Museum. I will not belabor this point, but I must mention that the curators and administrators of Middleton Place Foundation, which is a plantation, have said that Ashley Sack is the most important thing they own in their collections. And yet they have now decided to let it go, to let it be, and to let it breathe in spaces that are curated by descendants of enslaved people themselves and by others who may not be descendants of enslaved people, who may not be Black or have an African heritage, but who are committed to narrating these stories from the head and the heart. I commend them for that because I think it might have been a bit of a challenging decision for them to make. So the first owner of the sack that we know of is a woman named Rose, who had little control over her own life and no financial assets, but who nevertheless was able to pass down an object of invaluable worth. Rose was unfree. She was an enslaved Black woman in Charleston in the 1850s who found out that her child was about to be stolen from her. When I use the word stolen, I don't mean that this action would have been against the law in the state of Charleston, because no, it was perfectly legal what was about to happen, which was her child was going to be sold away because their legal owner had died, and he had instructed his widow in his will that his assets be liquidated so that each of his children could receive a large cash payout. When Rose learned that her daughter Ashley was to be snatched away from her, she grabbed this sack, now known as Ashley's sack, and she packed it with a variety of items. The sack wasn't going to be for Rose, who would herself end up in a slave pen not much longer after her daughter was sold. But instead, the sack would be for Ashley, who was only 9 years old. Rose thought quickly, on her feet, in a state of emergency, about what it might take to keep one small girl alive. And Rose's answer to that question might be evident in the things she packed that day. A dress, a braid, pecans, and a mother's love. Rose gave Ashley this packed sack on the eve of their separation. Ashley passed it down to her granddaughter, Ruth Middleton. Ruth, a free woman who moved north to Philadelphia during the first wave of the Great Migration of African Americans to urban areas in the States, embroidered the sack with this story, saving it for history, and sealing with thread a Black mother's eternal love. Ruth Middleton's sewn inscription, which you are viewing right now on the sack itself, reads, "My great-grandmother Rose, mother of Ashley, gave her this sack when she was sold at age 9 in South Carolina. It held a tattered dress, 3 handfuls of pecans, a braid of Rose's hair. Told her it'd be filled with my love always." She never saw her again. Ashley is my grandmother, Ruth Middleton, 1921. Here, just a transcription so that you can read the script a little bit easier. So almost none of the items that Rose packed have survived with the sack. I say almost none because I do believe that one thing survived. I bet you can guess what it is. That's right. And that's what I felt when I first encountered this object in the museum. Museums can be cold places, and yet the love in this sack seemed to be able to push past the confines of the thing itself and of the case it was in, to reach out and embrace not just me, but other people in the museum too, who would stop, who would still themselves, who would actually kind of get down into a lower posture in front of the sack, and who would cry. In all that she carried, I think through the different objects that Rose packed, and I try to consider the symbolic meanings of those items. And I include a number of historical photographs to help to orient me and readers and listeners to that mode of interpretation. I'm going to show you a few examples here, and I'm going to just move on because we have a dialogue to get to. So clothing and dress comes up quite a lot in the book as I explore the meaning of fabric and the meaning of having clothing that could make them feel proud for enslaved Black people. And hair is something I also discuss in the book quite a lot, thinking about its aesthetic and spiritual dimensions and the ways in which hair holds our DNA and so connects family members together and also connects the entire human race one to another. I talk about pecans in the book. Remember that Rose packed 3 handfuls? And I try to get to the bottom of how it was that Rose could even get her hands on pecans and what it might mean that she could access these nuts, which were actually a luxury food item in the Southeast at the time. And I also talk about community, people supporting one another, which is another way in which love existed then and still exists now in the form of the sack. The embroidered story of forced separation and loss on this sack, so common in the history of slavery, and yet breathtakingly particular to this mother and daughter, tells us not only that Black women survived the atrocity of captivity, but also how. Through identifying the physical and emotional needs of their children and family members, and generously providing those essential things to the best of their ability. This bag was no ordinary object, but instead a prescription for survival, and evidence of emergency planning in the face of disaster. In the material culture of African America, it is one of a kind. Rose's hope for her daughter's perseverance was realized. Her vision for Ashley came to be, for Ashley persisted, as did her daughter Rosa, and her daughter Ruth, and hers Dorothy. So one of the things that I explore in the book that I feel most important to share with you today, especially in light of the symposium that took place, in which public history was such an important component, is that artifacts from the history of slavery can help us to see the realness of slavery, to interpret the history of slavery, and also to connect with one another. What you're seeing on the screen right now is a quilt that was made by Harriet Powers, who was a formerly enslaved African-American quilter from Georgia. She is now thought of as one of the best quilters in American textile history. And this quilt was on display in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, along with another quilt that she had made that has survived. And these two quilts were part of a larger exhibit that was all about quilting. But when I was there in the hall, where I saw people spending the bulk of their time was in front of Harriet Powers' quilts. Quilts made by a formerly enslaved woman that help us to see her as a real person and as an artist and as someone who was conscious of history happening before her and around her. This quilt includes a record of historical events. Some of these squares show interpretations of Bible verses, but some of them show depictions of things that happened in the past. The one I like talking about the most is nearly in the center. It's the one with the orange shooting stars. I see you nodding, so I think that you've pinpointed it. That is an historical event that took place in 1833. It's the Leonid meteor shower. And Harriet Powers, a formerly enslaved black woman, put that event in her quilt, giving us another kind of historical source about the event. And now I just want to move on to briefly talk about some of the ways in which readers have reacted to this notion that I share in Ashley's sack, that things from the past, even from some of the darkest days of the past, can have meaning and value and importance for us today. They can help us to redefine our own sense of selves, communities, and relationships. This is a story that came out in the New York Times a couple of years ago for Juneteenth, and in it, I was asked to look at photographs that had been commissioned of Black family heirlooms and to redefine the meaning of an heirloom. And I invited my former graduate student, Michelle May Curry, who is now a co-author with me on a number of projects, to work with me. And when we created this piece in which we comment on the images and talk about how anything can be an heirloom, it doesn't have to be your great-grandmother's pearls. We got such an amazing reaction that the Times actually opened up a digital space for people to post images of things that were important to them and to talk about why they were important. So there was a lot of readership and community engagement with this notion of redefining a family heirloom, of an expansion of our sense of the things that are important and valuable. I have gotten so many photographs from readers, and these just always touch my heart, of all that she carried with special items that have been passed down in the family of the readers. And this one is showing some jewelry that the reader's mother would wear to dances in Harlem. And she said reading the book made her go find those pieces that had been in a jewelry box or tucked away and to pull them out and to think about them in an entirely new way. And she said that going back to these pieces helped her to reconnect with her mother. There have also been a number of people who have created new craft items, who have engaged in new projects in response to their reading of Rose, Ashley, and Ruth's story. There are many of these that I could share with you, and maybe we'll get into more of this later. But here's one that I wanted to show. Diana Waymar is an embroiderer, and if you enjoy needle arts, you might like going to her Instagram, which is Tiny Pricks. And she chooses vintage material, vintage fabrics, and she embroiders on them quotes that interest her from politicians and from writers, from artists. And I didn't know of Diana. I just saw that this image appeared on her Instagram. It'd be filled with my love always. And of course, it just knocked me off my feet to think that an artist would be inspired by that line and that she would find an antique sugar sack, an entirely appropriate material also connected to the history of slavery as cotton is, in very traumatic ways, for reproducing that line. So I am actually very proud to say that this sack is now in my collection because I asked, can I possibly buy that beautiful piece of art? And she sold it to me, and then she made another. And I will just finish. She made another for herself. I'm going to finish this by saying that I learned today at the Van Gogh Museum that Van Gogh also made many copies of his works. Interesting parallel there. Thank you so very much for your attention.
Oh, did I? Tiya, please join me. It's just going to be two girlfriends talking, and you guys just can listen in, okay? Thank you so very much for sharing. I see we both have our heirlooms with us. I have to tell you a funny, momentary story. I'm also wearing a ring that, for those Surinamese in the room, will recognize. My brother, this is many years ago, when first time I came to the Netherlands, he says, I'm giving you a family heirloom. It's the family knot. It's special for our family. And I was like really moved by it. And then several years later, and he said he had it made just, it's part of our family heirloom. I went to Suriname, and I happened to notice a lot of people were wearing the same ring. And I thought, wait, you're not in our family. I thought this was just our family knot. So my brother made the whole story up.
Oh my, the creative one.
But then he said, but it is our family. It is our cultural family. And all the people you saw wearing it are part of our heritage. So I forgave him, but I still felt like he duped me a little bit. Anyway, I digress. Tiya, thank you so much. I know we have lots we want to talk about, and time is not on our side. So I'm going to be brief. Ian, where is he? He's here looking over my shoulder. But I want to give us enough space and also enough time for the audience to engage in this conversation about this amazing book, which I've read a couple of times, and each time I'm so emotionally moved because it does bring me back to a place of memory within my own family heritage and culture. For those of you who don't know me, my parents and ancestors come from Suriname. I've traced my family to the first generation of Tosh. And I am in some ways the keeper of our family memory and heritage, because I didn't have a lot of memory as a child in terms of things to keep. When I was growing up, it was like I needed to store things. So I felt very connected to the story in the book. But to start off our conversation, and I know a lot of people have asked me to ask this of you, give us a little bit of background into how did you weave together so delicately the storytelling aspect and the historical, empirical research that you had to do? It was like a dance a two-step dance between this very academic approach you took, but yet finding the way to tell it as a story. Can you give us a little bit of insight into that?
I'd be happy to share some thoughts about that. When I decided that I was going to write a book about Ashley Sack, it was not a rational decision at all. It was an emotional decision. I felt almost as if I was being pulled into the sack itself. My reaction was so strong to see in the sack, and I just knew I had to write a book about it. It wasn't until I started doing the preliminary research that I realized that that was going to be a very challenging task, because the sack itself was the only primary source material that connected the whole story together. There were very few documents about Rose and Ashley. There were many more items about Ruth, because she lived in a later period. But there was a big gap between Ashley's lifetime and Ruth's lifetime. And I felt at that moment that I had a difficult choice to make. Should I just turn away and leave the project behind, maybe
Yeah.
write an article instead, or would I still write the book? I felt that I had to write the book. I felt that I was committed to writing the book. And that just pushed me into a new space as a scholar. It was a space of working with not nearly enough, but knowing that the work had to be done.
I'm one of the questions that's really also, I keep trying to grapple with. How did Ruth know what was in the sack?
So I think the key to that, as the key to many aspects of this story, is actually in the sack itself. I mean, the sack, when I was feeling lost with, oh my goodness, the documents aren't here, I had to return to the object. There was no other choice. That's really all that I had. And so I kept reading this sack. Reading, staring at it, sitting with it.
And it's really big. I don't know.
It is big.
It doesn't really show on the images, but I've
Don't get
seen
the
it in
sense.
the museum, and it's
Yes.
quite large. A lot of things could fit into this sack.
It's huge. I mean, the fabric, you only saw the kind of middle portion in the images, but the fabric just flows back down when it's hanging. It's quite long. So I returned to the sack and thought about it a lot and tried to think about every line, tried to think about every word, tried to think about the different colors, tried to think about the shape of the embroidery. And all of those moments of reflection with the sack helped me to better understand what Rose and Ashley's story was according to Ruth,
Yeah.
which I think is a really important point to make, because even though I feel confident about the history that I've reconstructed here, we have to recognize that we are never with history. We're never in history. It's the past. We can't get there. It's gone as far as our lives are concerned. There will always be a space, a gap, an unknowable aspect to that history. But to answer your question, on the sack Ruth embroidered told her, right? Excuse me. Which was the clue to me that this was an oral history that had been passed down. And it's my strong view that that is how Ruth knew. She says Ashley is my grandmother. Right?
Yeah. Did you have to struggle with, because oral history for so long, and you know where I'm going with this, has not been seen in the academic space as legitimate way of archiving or documenting. And culturally, it's a very important part of our way of recording the past. How did you balance that as an academic with incorporating the oral history part of this?
Mm-hmm. Well, I am fortunate, and we are all fortunate, that scholars who were working in the 70s, 80s, 90s, the early 2000s started to try to renew their methods for studying topics that are difficult to access, like slavery. And they started looking to oral histories that had already been collected to see what they could find out about the everyday lives of enslaved people. So in the field of slavery studies, we do have a track record of the use of oral histories and also the use of narratives that were written by or told by, as told to narratives that held the experiences of formerly enslaved people. So in the field of African diaspora studies, Black studies, slavery studies, oral histories are more accepted. I also work in Native American history, and this is another field in which the oral tradition and oral history have been very crucial areas and methods. And so for me, it felt like a natural step.
Got it.
And the fields, the historical fields, I think are catching up.
It's getting there.
Mm-hmm.
It's really, I think that's a great segue to, it's important to contextualize the story of Ashley Sack in a transnational way. The challenge, of course, I'm sure you're aware of, is bringing an American story to the rest of the world. how do we make meaning in, and I'm just curious, I'm going to ask, I know this was not a part of the program for this one, Ian, but did anybody bring any keepsakes with them? Because it was the last program, it was part of the ask, bring something with you. But it's really, and we chatted about this briefly, how do we make meaning for many who are in this room who are doing this similar kind of work, including my family, using the symbolism of Ashley Sack in a global context?
Mm-hmm. I feel that there are maybe 3 questions tucked into that one question, Jennifer. One part of the global or transatlantic context for this particular story, this is going to be obvious the moment I say it, is that the mostly English colonists, but not all English, who founded the town of Charleston on indigenous land were coming from other parts of the world. And Charleston in particular had a number of people who had emigrated from Barbados and the Bahamas. They went there to start the plantations after leaving places like London. And so these histories that may on the face of it seem as if they are national histories in a very discrete way are all transatlantic histories. I mean, slavery as a system was just incredibly intricate and widespread. So there are always going to be multifaceted, multinational pieces to any story of enslavement. It's also, I think, obviously the case that all human populations have, at some point in their history, as far as we can tell, engaged in this kind of behavior in terms of holding other people as bondspeople, as captives, as slaves. So histories of slavery exist all around the world. The kind of slavery that you and I are most focused on is a transatlantic slavery, which helped to usher in and to shape the modern world as we know it today. But it's not the only kind of slavery, because human beings have done and still do very terrible things. So the topic just opens up across the globe, and across the years, because sadly, people do this. People treat one another in horrible ways.
And I think for this, what I appreciate, and also I'm a little nervous about, because the translation into Dutch presents other challenges in terms of how there are some things that are not easily translatable. I don't know if Shirley is here, or members of Reading in Black, a book club, and Ashley Sack was one of the, All That She Carried was one of the books, and they chose to read the book in English because they were afraid of what can happen when we try to translate certain terms or ideas that don't necessarily cross over easily. I know that Grace is here, who did a translation from French to Dutch. She's raising her hand, and I know you understand this. So, in terms of meaning, like, one of the things that you want to ensure and I know you were actively engaged in the process of the translation, did you have to have these questions about terms and the use of certain terms in the new edition of the book?
Well, I want to roll that question back just a moment to say that in English itself, even just within English, there's a real difficulty with finding the right terms, and there are investments in these different terms. And I wrote in the book about decisions that I was wrestling with, having to do with what term do I use? Should I use the word slave at all? Is it ever okay to use that word, especially in our current moment when many descendants and descendants groups have said, we don't like that word because it basically reduces a person to their status of chattel bondage? Do I use the word plantation? especially because there have been critiques in the literature around how plantation still carries for many readers and listeners this connotation of a beautiful romantic place with lots of grass and the gorgeous buildings and et cetera, right? So that word, even in English,
Yes.
seems to romanticize the history of slavery. I didn't have any questions with the Dutch translation. And I'll be curious to know what people think as they read it. But I did have a difficulty with the Chinese translation.
Oh.
And quite a lot of difficulty with, and I don't understand the reasoning for some of this, but they really wanted to change the title to a title that I thought didn't signify anything
Related.
about the focus of the book. And it was very difficult to try to translate kinship terms in a way that was satisfying to the person who was doing the translation into Chinese. I suspect there are many more issues like that.
Wow.
that I will learn about over time. And my main takeaway is just that language is hard and slavery is hard. When you put those two things together,
Well, yeah.
right?
So beware when you're reading the translation. To be mindful, I think, is important. But I think the other question about meaning making is, for me, a really important theme. And I really love the fact that we have these 3 generations of women. And that is often a narrative that's not centered in colonial discourse or in literature. And that weaving the lives of these 3 generations of women through just this one object. And the idea of the love practitioners, I want to just take a moment to talk a little bit about what does that mean, and how can we take the horror of this lived experience and still at the center of it, as she so beautifully does with the embroidery, find a way to talk about love. Can you give us some insight into the process of your writing and using this sort of as a central theme?
Well, I will also use this wonderful question to pivot back to your question about global connections. Because you have just said it as you articulated that question, which is that this book is about women who lived lives that are terrible to imagine. And women live lives that are terrible to imagine all around the world, not just in one place. Often in the book, I try to make reference to gendered experience writ large as a way to help us to remember that while this is a book about one particular Black American family in a certain place, in a certain time, it's also a book about women who were trying to care for one another, who were trying to act as mothers in a society that sought to control them and to control their bodies and to control the children that they had. It's a book about women's craft and creativity. It's a book about women's textiles. It's a book about sacks and seeds. And I mean, one of the things that I loved in doing this research, the research took me all over in my mind, was reading about a theory that it was a woman who created the sack in the first place. Because where are you going to put that baby?
Right.
And still do the work that you need to do for your community. You're probably going to create some kind of carrier. So the book opens up in a very broad way about women's lives and experiences and creativity, across national borders. Coming to the question of love's practitioners and how this book, or at least how I tried to help this book, center hope in the end. I again just took my cues from my main primary source, which was the sack. And you said it in your question. I was quite afraid early on. Remember when I mentioned that my decision was not rational? I was quite afraid early on because as a scholar, I'm supposed to be working with this stuff up here, right? Whatever, whatever's going on in my mind, right? I'm supposed to be asking tough questions, looking at all the sources and corroborating this and that, and being really critical of my sources and being really skeptical. And I eventually came to that. But at first I wasn't there, and I was worried that I wouldn't be able to write a history that was robust enough to stand among other histories that I admire.
Right.
I found my strength, or I regained my orientation by reading that sack again.
Over and over.
Yes, and by seeing, just as you said, the central concept is love. The primary source is telling me that. I did not make that up. As a scholar, I work with my sources. I try to understand what they tell me. Ashley Sack is telling us, I strongly believe, that love is what we are to see here. That love is the main theme, it's the main concept.
Yeah.
It's the major gift that Rose gave to Ashley and that Ashley passed down and that we now all receive
Generations later.
as their cultural kin. So I agree with your brother. We can have cultural kin.
That's right.
We can be in cultural kinship with everyone in this space.
There is so many questions, and I'm watching the clock winding down, and I want to give enough time for the Q&A, but I do have one more, because the importance of the material heritage, the also intangible that we cannot necessarily know or see, for those who are doing this type of research, and I know Saeed Hartman is one of your inspirations, could you give us a little bit of more insight into the kind of framework that you use to be able to create such a beautiful story?
So I just said this, but I'll say it again. Identify your sources and try to spend a lot of time with them, to think carefully with them, and try to get a range of materials. Some of these sources might be objects that were created by humans. Some of them might be aspects of the natural world. I have found that trees can be incredibly forthcoming sources in the history of slavery, sometimes in ways that are inspiring, enslaved people hiding in the woods and finding kind of a safe haven there, sometimes in ways that are terrifying. I won't go into those ways. I'm sure that you can imagine them. But I would say look for all the sources you can. Put them next to each other. Compare, contrast them, test them against one another. I'd also say talk with people. Talk with family members if you're doing a family history. Talk with friends, talk with colleagues, talk with neighbors. Look for existing oral histories. If you can't find any, create your own oral history project to collect and preserve those stories. And I think it also helps quite a lot to write in community. And that can mean writing in community with people whose work you have only read. It can also mean writing in community with people that you get to spend a full day with at a symposium, going home and keeping those connections and maybe trading work over time. There were a number of people who I had the great privilege of thinking with and writing with as I developed this book, and it made all the difference.
Thank you, Tiya. I'm going to pause now to someone has microphones to open up the conversation with the audience. We don't have a lot of time for Q&A, so please make your questions. As the moderator, my role is to ask you to be brief, be simple, one question. I know, I'm sorry, but that's what we have to do. First, identify who you are, your name.
So my name is Dr. Linda Bongabona.
Hello.
Hi. It's going to be very difficult to be brief.
I know.
I will do my best.
Try.
So to ask my question, I need to give you a little bit of context. I have my ancestry in the Kingdom of Congo in Africa. And 8 generations ago, one of our people went missing in my family, a child. She was caught in the human trafficking and sent to over the Atlantic. We had to move because there were so many slave raids. And since we moved in what we call the Great Migration, as you do as well, to avoid to have more people, more casualties, there's no one generation that was born in the same place of their parents, including me and my children. So that's, when I think about this story, one of my questions is, when you tell this story, how much of your identity as African American, meaning as a person who has to assimilate for generation and generation, is projected in the identity of your character, the characters who are real, compared to what this person could have been as an African, as my family was?
Thank you. That's a beautiful question.
Well, I don't think that scholars can approach their projects with objectivity. I think that we have to be tough-minded, but that doesn't mean that we're able to separate ourselves from the work that we produce. And so I suspect that there's quite a lot of me in this book. It's there from the very beginning, from the choice to even write it. It's there in the way that I frame the story. It's there in the way that I plot the history, because even histories do have plots. They have an arrangement of events that are described as unfolding over time. And if I were a different person with different questions, I might well have tried to invert this story. I might have tried to think about starting with Rose and going backward in time, like trying to trace her own ancestry, trying to see if I could identify where it was that her mother, more likely, or her grandmother had come from in West or West Central Africa. But those were not my questions, I think partly because of who I am and what my interests are.
So in other words, you did bring yourself into this process.
I think we always do.
And that, I think, is a very important point. And not to call out Dutch scholars, work more or less to keep more of an emotional distance from historical narrative. I think that is a key takeaway for me in how do we move to the next level. Where do we go from here? Let's allow a couple more questions. Peggy. Look at Peggy. Brandon. And I'm calling out Peggy for a very particular reason, because Peggy Brandon is what we call the quartermaker for the development of the National Slavery Museum. And I know she's looking at me like, how could you do this? But I think it's an important, no, I really feel, because the process of what you're going through with all the communities in the Netherlands, there must be a question you would want to ask Dr. Miles in terms of collecting, because this is part of the process. So please ask a question.
Well, I would say I would give my right and my left hand for an object like this, definitely.
Yes. I can imagine.
There they go. But more in general, so we are making a museum in the Netherlands that's starting without the objects. And yes, I was in Charleston, and I went to a lot of, and also to many of the, what people call plantations. I went to one plantation and I was greeted with, "You are now entering a forced work camp." And I thought, that's one way of putting it, the MacLeod plantation near Charleston.
Yes, I've been there.
Yes.
Yes, they have an interesting,
a different
and
way.
Updated, way of interpreting the history.
Yes,
for sure.
non-biased, as they would say. My question would be around objects. Since, what do you think the real impact of this object is? Since, from the Dutch perspective, we're still really searching where we can make the connection with the lived experience, where it's not an object that's an object of violence, or that is a descriptive object, but really the voice itself. So what do you think the effect is of a sack like this or other objects? What does it make people feel like?
Yeah.
Whichever part of the color spectrum they are on.
Question.
Thank you.
Thank you for making that comment about hoping that we should find an object like this. I wish and hope for you that you do too. I know I'm going over material information that you already know from your previous conversations with Dr. Bunch and others. But just to share with everybody else here, the Smithsonian African American Museum started without collections. And they now have so many remarkable, incredible things, which they were able to, excuse me, identify and procure or borrow because they entered into partnerships with small museums, community museums. They went on a tour around the country. That's how they found Ashley Sack. They just turned up in small places and asked, what have you got? So there very well may be some very special artifacts that turn up for the new museum here. Yes, I mean, if anyone has such an artifact, please
Peggy.
share it. Share it with everyone by donating it to the new museum that's in the works.
Thank you. Another question. I think we have time for one more. Oh, you have more?
May I, Jennifer? I know, but I have to talk about the object part and their particularity, because I want to say that I thought about the question a lot as I was working on the book. The question of, it's a thing. Why is that different than if it were a piece of paper? And I'm somebody who has worked quite a lot with pieces of paper in the past. I hadn't written a material culture history before this one. And what I come to are a couple of ideas that I borrowed from other scholars who really work in archaeology and architectural history. One of those ideas is sensory accessibility. That if we're looking at something on a page, we're reading the words, our brains are just doing a lot of flips and cartwheels to connect us with the ideas. When we have an object, it's sort of there. It's closer to us and it's more immediate because our senses are engaging with it instantaneously. This is my grandmother's pocketbook, by the way. This is her fanciest one. And I inherited this after she passed away. And I just hung it on a peg in my wall for many years. And I decided to carry it to an event not so long ago. And I was looking through the purse at that time to see what I could stuff, where can my lipstick go, etc. And I found my godmother's high school graduation ticket.
What?
Yes, my mom's big sister, who's my godmother. Her ticket was in my grandmother's pocketbook from the 1950s.
Wow. That's amazing.
So that was a double hit of sensory accessibility, right? Because now I feel
more meaning.
that I'm there in that time period.
That's amazing. It's a beautiful story. Thank you. I think we have time for one last question, burning question. Amandla? No, it's not Amandla. I did it again. Sensu, thank you very much. The microphone.
Of course, I need this. Yeah, so...
You're a little bit muffled through the mask, so maybe...
Yeah, okay.
Please, thank you.
Yeah, so you briefly touched on descriptions about the sack and also on translations. And both of them can reoppress or have oppressive discourses when descriptions are done in a certain way or when translations are done in a certain way. And in the Netherlands, there has been lots of debate by the grassroots about museum descriptions and also about translations. And a lot of it has been about, the creators or the authors who are passed away, like the debate about Fanon, Black Skin, White Mask translation, or the Baldwin translation. These authors are passed away. But I was wondering, you're alive and kicking.
Let's hope a little while longer.
How much power do the authors have when it comes to the translation? Because when you write something, you write it with a certain intent. You know, you write it to do something in the world. Yeah, it seems like the publishers have all the power, but I was wondering, what power do authors have, and what influence can authors do when they realize, you know, the thing you want the work to do is being undone by the translator, and the biases and politics offset translator?
Thank you for that.
You have said quite a lot, and there's more that you haven't said that I think many of us can feel. I will come to the heart of your question in a moment, but I want to say that there is translation all throughout this book at every stage of the history. And when I decided I was going to write a book about this Zach, I was also acting as a translator, you know, certainly an interpreter, and I was seizing the power to retell these women's stories. Is that okay? Did I have the right to do that? I wasn't sure at the time. I'm still not 100% sure. But what I did to try to reassure myself that this was not a story that I should leave be because it wasn't my right, was to talk with people who were closer to the story, who I could find. I think it's really important to have consultative processes, even if you are yourself a descendant of enslaved people, which I am, but I'm not descended from these individuals. Even so, even after having those kinds of conversations, there are going to be places where the interpretation of the person who has the power to interpret or translate is going to veer away from the intention of the person who originally told the story or created the document. I cannot get into Ruth's head, and I don't know what she thought, and I don't know what she would think of what I have done, which is the reason why at the end of the book I actually ask for the forgiveness and the grace of Rose, Ashley, and Ruth, just in case they didn't want this, and just in case I got it wrong. I realize that that is just rhetorical, but I think that there are spiritual dimensions to it, and I think it's an important act to engage in. When it comes to what you're asking about, contemporary authors, such as us, and the work we do, and how much control we have, and how publishers get involved, and how museums get involved, and so on, I think that this is a really tricky area, because we certainly do not have all the power, and actually neither do the institutions that might partner with us to help us to publish or to create a project or to put our stories out there, because we live in a market-driven world. And in many cases, people who are going to invest in a project are thinking, is this project going to sell? Who's going to read it? I actually had a number of presses who said, this story is too small. We're going to pass. Nobody's going to read that. Do I feel a bit of satisfaction saying that right now? Maybe a little bit. But what helped me to be able to keep moving with the story and to find an editor who understood what I felt was important to do with the story, took the support of colleagues who are also working on slavery studies, many of them black women, and it took the support of friends and family members who were with me when I had moments when I wasn't sure if I could keep going forward. And it actually took the support of people, no matter what physical packaging they might come in, who were in positions of authority and power in institutions who stood up for me. So I think this is a point about relationships and everybody doing what they can to support those who are involved in this kind of very important work, to help them to bring their visions forward and to share those with communities.
That's beautifully said. Beautifully said. I think that's a wonderful place to end. Stand up with me. Please, could you hand me that sack? I want to present you with a sack from us filled with love. Is Iris Ira Kip still here? I didn't think that. Oh, from Kip Republic. There's so much love practitioners in this room who we wanted to fill a sack for you to take with you. So we have here a pin that's about the Cabra Mask, which I'm sure you're not familiar with, but it is a story of a keepsake that has become a very important heirloom here of our culture. It is part of the Ketikoti commemoration. The 1873 button, because we are now coming to the end of the 10 years that was added on to the legal abolition of slavery, that is now part of also, I think, an important keepsake. Well, I would be remiss without saying my book.
Perfect, thank you.
Just saying. A copy of the book is, I don't know if any of my co-authors are here, but Wim, who's a partner, because Nancy was not able. Where's Wim? Raise your hand, Wim. There he is. So he gets to take the position of Nancy Yao, and is Anna Marie here? So anyway, our co-authors, a copy of our book. Also a shirt from Kip Republic. This is the Hiri Hiri, which is coming up. Oh my gosh, you guys really did good job. Hiri Hiri is a meal talking about material culture that is prepared by the Kip Republic organization. For 10,000 meals will be produced this year, am I right? 80,000 that is being prepared in the Royal Palace, I'm just saying. So there's so many mementos of our love to you, to say thank you so much.
Thank you.
And to thank all of you.
Thank
But
you.
we're not over
Thank
yet.
you for testimony. Thank you, Jennifer.
I want to invite Russell Shorto. Are you going to give a closing remarks? And just again to thank you all for being here, for your energy, for your love, for clearing the space. This is a very, it can be a very dense space to be in, and all the love that is coming towards us, I think, has helped to clear it. So thank you so much, and Russell will give us our closing remarks. Applause for Russell Shorto. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really a lovely presentation, Dr. Miles. Well, I just want to say it's wonderful to be back in Amsterdam, and that I understand the weather has been exactly like this all spring. So aren't you lucky? JK. We were having dinner. I used to live in Amsterdam. I now live in Maryland. We were having dinner last week at home, and I was talking with my wife and with Anthony, our 14-year-old son, who's here, and my stepson, Benjamin, who's 23. And Benjamin lived a good chunk of his life here and then in the US, so he has an experience of the educational system in both countries. And so talking about the two slavery conferences that this wraps up, and today I asked him what he learned in the Dutch system about slavery. They learned about slavery, he said. They learned about that it was mostly in the American South. He talked about plantations, the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln, the Emancipation Proclamation. They did not learn about slavery in the northern states in the US. They didn't learn about slavery in New England, which was quite a significant thing, though Americans mostly associate New England with the abolition movement to end slavery. They did not learn about how New York City was a major slave market, how at one time 42% of New York households owned at least one enslaved person, second only to Charleston, South Carolina. They also didn't learn about slavery in the Netherlands. Or rather, they did. They learned that slavery was illegal in the Netherlands. End of story. Now, Benjamin is a citizen of the world today, so he knows perfectly well. He's been around and absorbed a lot of what's been going on for the past, especially year or two, in this commemoration year, and so is quite aware that in fact, slavery has been very much a part of the Netherlands. That slavery, for example, was part of the business model of the VOC in Asia. That slavery essentially was the business model of the West India Company in the Americas, and that slavery has been woven into a lot of Dutch history since then. That, for example, in the 19th century, when abolition was on the rise, the Nederlandse Bank was woven into the business of slavery. So this year is this year, next year, and the year after are the 400th anniversary of the Dutch founding of what became New York, because it depends on what you choose to consider the marker. I started something at the New York Historical Society in New York City called the New Amsterdam Project. And working together with Deborah Hamer of the New Netherland Institute in Albany, we began to brainstorm various things that we could do to mark this occasion. And we started to think about a conference on the Dutch transatlantic slave trade. I happened to have a meeting at the U.S. Embassy in The Hague not long after, and people there said that they would be interested to support this conference, provided their mission is to promote aspects of what's going on in America here to a Dutch public. So if we could come up with a way to broadcast that information to a Dutch public, then they would help support it by sending Dutch scholars to the Netherlands for this conference. So then we met here with Michiel Hauser and Suze Zijlstra and others from the Scheepvaart Museum, and we hit on this idea. So last month in New York, we had a 2-day conference. One day, the first day was at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in Harlem, and the second day was at the New York Historical Society. And today, we had the sort of third day of this conference with several of the same participants. It has been, I think, a meaningful series of talks for everyone involved. We brought 10 scholars, 10 Dutch scholars, and 10 American scholars, and 1 Belgian scholar, I think, to New York. And, in recent years, people in both countries have been doing very intensive study of this, particularly within a Dutch context and within an American context. So the idea was to bring these two together into conversation. And I think the end result, in New York, both days were sold out. I mean, granted, it was free, but it's still something that both days were sold out. We had educators, museum professionals, students, teachers, and not insignificantly, we had an interesting blending of a Harlem audience and an Upper West Side audience. And they brought lots of new insights to a scholarly public and a general public. And we're talking about a lot of things going forward, including publishing some of the papers in academic journals as well as in more popular outlets. Among the many new insights that I took from these events, that there were hundreds of Africans living in Amsterdam in the time of Rembrandt, and in fact, many of them lived in the neighborhood that Rembrandt lived in. You may be familiar with the moderately famous Rembrandt painting of 2 African men in the Mauritshuis. They were probably neighbors of his who may well have been sailors. The artist Wenceslas Haller portrayed African women and children in Amsterdam. The women were almost certainly household servants. So it's interesting to see some images of Africans in the Dutch Republic at that time. And it's also rare because, as has been talked about this evening and at both of these conferences, there's documentary evidence, but it's rare to see actual physical evidence. In New Netherland, among the many interesting findings, Jaap Jacobs, who's here, has produced a fascinating paper giving very good evidence for when the first enslaved Africans arrived in New Amsterdam, and that was in the year 1627, only a year after the city was founded. So it was there right from the start. Andrea Mosterman, who's here, has talked about the intimacy of slavery in New Amsterdam. New Amsterdam was 16 streets, 300 houses, all kind of packed together pretty closely. And she, in her book, Spaces of Enslavement, and in the presentation she gave both in New York and here, unpacks that a little bit. What was it like for all of these people to live in such close quarters? Among other things, she talks about there were particular taverns in New Amsterdam that the Africans favored. So little details like that begin to give you a sense of the life that was being lived. We learned that freedom was a possibility in this evolving Dutch system, but freedom came with strings attached. So there were a number of cases in New Amsterdam where people petitioned for their freedom and won it, and they were given land. So you think, oh, well, that's wonderful. Well, they also had, for the rest of their lives, to pay for their freedom. They had to pay the West India Company or their previous owner. So presumably they were given land so that they could raise crops so that they had something to pay back with. As well, even if they were given freedom, there was the possibility that when they died, their children would be enslaved again. So they had this hanging over their head their whole lives. Talking about the closeness of the quarters in New Amsterdam, I want to draw your attention to a really interesting project that Oscar Hefting and Jaap Jacobs are engaged in right now. They're developing I almost said life-size, it's not a life-size, a scale model of New Amsterdam, an actual physical model. You can see it right upstairs on the second floor, and I'm told, I hope I'm right, that after this evening, and I'll finish in just a moment, you can go up there and get a sense of it. So what they have is a piece of the model, and it's going to be huge. I mean, not quite as big as this whole space, but it's going to be an enormous replica of New Amsterdam, and it really kind of brings it to life in a remarkable way. And by the way, they're raising money to build the rest of it, so if anybody is interested in backing it, I'm sure they would be happy to talk to you. Among the challenges that scholars have to face going forward, as has been noted, the evidence that we have, the records that we have are almost entirely from the enslavers, the documents, the slave manifests, census records, church records. However, there are tantalizing bits, there are tantalizing artifacts that if you look, you can find. I curated an exhibit that is up now at the New York Historical Society about New Amsterdam, and we were struggling to find, when you have a historical museum, you want to find stuff, objects that you can put in it, and we wanted to find, to exhibit items of New Amsterdam that represented African culture. Lo and behold, the New York State Museum has in its collection, it had never been on display before, in 1983 in New Amsterdam, in a little alley outside the home of Cornelis van Tienhoven, who was sort of the right-hand man of Peter Stuyvesant, was found a basket. It was a woven basket buried in the ground with a Dutch plate on top, and there were dozens of objects in the basket. Animal bones, marbles, pieces of clay pipes, pottery. And I'm told by Barbaro Martinez Ruiz, who is an African art historian at Oxford, that this is called an impungu. Impungu means collection, and it was a kind of cross between healing and medicine. So, and he said what you would do, all of these items would be, in Congo culture, would have been used, and they would have been gathered by someone for a particular healing purpose. And you pick the certain items for a particular purpose, and typically on a weekly basis, he said, someone would remove the top, and this healer would fill usually a man, fill his mouth with alcohol, like brandy, and spray it on these objects to kind of animate them. And this would bring about, over time, this process of healing, maybe for an individual, maybe for a society. So an object like this begins to give you a whole different sense of New Amsterdam than what you get from most books, for example. Which brings me back to Professor Miles, who shows us one way forward with Ashley Sack. A lot of historians are trained to use documents, pieces of paper, But as she has told us, there are other kinds of documents, and we can work with them. And what is required, which I think some historians are a little bit hesitant to use, is interpretation, a word that she used several times. I think that's part of a historian's toolkit. You know what you're given, the stuff of history. It's like dots. You know, here's a dot, here's a dot, here's a dot. We don't want you to just lay out the dots. We need you to use your experience and your knowledge to connect the dots. So that's what I think we need to do going forward, because we don't necessarily have the documents, or those that we have are really just telling one side of the story. So I hope that Professor Miles's work is a model that inspires many as we seek new ways to understand our past and who we are. Thank you to the Scheepvaart Museum. Thank you to the John Adams Institute. Thank you to the New Netherlands Institute, the New York Historical Society, the U.S. Embassy in The Hague, and I think I left out one important partner, but thank you too. And thank you all very much for being here. Yeah.
I just want to take a last moment to kind of bring us into the room again. Thank you, Russell Shorto. Thank you, Ian and Beth, for really allowing me to be your moderator. Thank you to Dr. Miles for just your full presence and sharing. I want to close with one thing about the hiri hiri meal. They are free hiri hiri. They are part of our traditional culture of serving in cassava and, help me, plantain and sweet potato. The Scheepvaart Museum is a site that will be, right, as well as John Adams Institute and many other locations, not only in Amsterdam, but in the Netherlands. Say that louder. 11. You guys have really grown. Oh my God. Okay. So the hiri hiri meals is an amazing part of a new tradition that's developed here over the last several years. So please there's a website. We can find the actual locations from the website. I just want to encourage everyone to become a part of that. Also, I just want to end with a poem. A poem. And I think Tiya, you'll recognize this. This is an adaptation from Saida Hartman's Venus in Two Acts. I think is really appropriate. So let's just take a moment to acknowledge our ancestral presence, bring them here in the room at the moment. How do we tell impossible stories? Stories about women, children, and men, bearing names that deface and disfigure, about the words exchanged between captives that were never recorded in the archives, their appeals, their prayers, their secrets were never uttered because no one was there to receive them. I think today we intended to tell these impossible stories and to amplify the impossibility of their telling. I don't think our intention is anything as miraculous as recovering the lives of the dead, of the enslaved, or redeeming the dead, but rather to paint a fuller picture of these lives that have been held captive by history. It is the irreparable violence of slavery that lives precisely in all the stories that we cannot know and that may never be recovered. This is the afterlife of slavery, a past that is yet to be fulfilled, and the ongoing state of emergency in which Black life remains in peril. So what do we do in the meantime? We must continue to interrogate the production of knowledge, establish who we are in relation to who we have been, recruiting, recovering, retrieving, reconciling, and repairing the past for the sake of the living and all the possible futures to come. Thank you so much.